Welcome to the 20th anniversary 215 Festival. My name is Jeff Waxman. I'm the programming advisor for this festival. And if you like today's event, you can keep up with our events all year long by signing up for our newsletter at 215festival.org. Tonight, we've got a wonderful program for you. Writing Queer Lives, featuring Melissa Faliveno, Christopher Gonzalez, and Krys Malcolm Belc. Melissa is the author of the debut essay collection Tomboy Land, named by NPR, the New York Public Library, Oprah Magazine, and Electric Literature as a best book of 2020. I also liked it, but that doesn't appear in every notice. Her book came out in August of 2020. Christopher Gonzalez is the author of I'm Not Hungry, But I Can Eat, forthcoming this fall from Santa Fe Writers Project. His writing has appeared in The Nation, Catapult, The Millions, and elsewhere, and he's a fiction editor at Barrel House. And Krys Malcolm Belc, hometown hero, is the author of the flash nonfiction chapbook In Transit and the forthcoming memoir from Counterpoint, The Natural Mother of the Child. We're going to have a series of readings from these fine writers, and then we will proceed to a sort of a free-flowing conversation on the topic of writing queer lives. To begin with, we're going to have Melissa Faliveno. Melissa?
Thank you for that introduction, Jeff. Can you all hear me okay? Looking all right? I'm going to put the fact that you liked it, Jeff, on the next edition of the book. Should I be so lucky to get another edition? Jeff also liked it. Thank you everybody for being here tonight. It's an honor to be here as part of this panel and reading and conversation. So I'm going to kick things off by reading from my debut essay collection. As Jeff mentioned, it's called Tomboy Land. It came out in August. And it's a collection of essays about a lot of things that kind of circle around gender, queerness, class, the land, specifically the Midwest, kind of the working class part of Wisconsin where I was born and raised. And then it's very far reaching from there. But I figured because this is a Writing Queer Lives panel, that I would read from probably what is the queerest of my queer essays. It's called Tomboy, and it's an essay about both sexuality and gender identity and place, and how those things for me are kind of inextricably bound. So I'm just going to read briefly a couple short sections from that essay, Tomboy. The night we first met, my partner was sure I was gay. And for what it's worth, I assumed the same of him, which makes for a pretty funny story to tell at parties. I don't talk about my sexuality or gender identity much. I've never felt particularly connected to a certain identity, nor has any language ever quite seemed to fit. And where I come from, we're not raised to talk about ourselves, let alone our sexual proclivities or gender identities. I had never even heard the term gender identity until late in college, when I took a bold leap and enrolled in a women's studies class. It hadn't occurred to me a person had a gender identity, let alone that it might be in conflict with their biological sex. I'm not straight, and my gender identity is complicated. I never really had a coming out, in part because I never thought I had the right, and in part, as difficult as it is to admit, because I'm still terrified to say some things aloud. But it's also because I so often feel like I don't have the words. There are words I use sometimes. Words like bisexual, which attempts to define who I'm attracted to and who I seek intimacy from. Words like genderqueer or simply queer, which attempts to define the ways my body doesn't conform to traditional notions of gender. I use these words because they're the best words I have. But sometimes they make me uneasy. And sometimes I feel like I'm still seeking the words that fit, that feel more right, that might help me feel like I belong. On average, I get misgendered at least twice a week. I get called sir far more often than ma'am or miss, a fact that makes itself most apparent in restaurants where servers still insist on addressing their guests in these binary terms. For you, sir, he will say, for the misgendering server is almost always a man. He might realize his mistake or second guess his assumptions. He'll stumble, flustered, stammer a bit. Oh, he might say, sorry. It's okay, I'll say, my voice bright and cheery and pitched up a notch, an attempt to sound more like a woman. No worries, happens all the time. I hate myself when I do this. I feel complicit in the system that shames me, complicit in preserving my own shame. But I keep this collection of words and tones in my linguistic toolbox anyway, for just such an occasion, and use them to reassure the perpetrator that I'm not angry, that I'm friendly and unthreatening, that I won't punish him with a bad tip or a scene, that I will be the one to accommodate him. Sometimes my dining companions remain oblivious to the small drama unfolding in front of them, but sometimes they notice, and this is worse. What the hell, they'll say, loud whispering as he scurries away. Don't worry about it, I'll say, trying to change the subject. But seriously, they'll insist, it's not like it's hard to tell. In the silence that follows, my dining companions, be they friends or family or colleagues or strangers, will look down at their plates, their embarrassment palpable. I'll sip my drink or stuff calamari into my mouth and know that what lives in that silence, at least for a moment or two, are thoughts about my body. Sometimes, at least, I get a free dessert out of it. In 6th grade, a new girl moved to town. We shared the same birthday, and I swore to myself that I would make her my best friend. I did, somehow, and for a few years we were inseparable. One night I sat alone on my bedroom floor with my yearbook open and ran my finger over her photo. Without thinking, I bent down and kissed the page where her lips, in grainy black and white, were locked in a half smile, my little heart hammering in my chest. In college, there was the girl in my poetry workshop who wrote an ode to new Chuck Taylors. There was the barista with the shaved head and a sleeve of tattoos. At the dawn of social media, when our MySpace pages became Facebook pages, we of the analog childhood discovered such platforms offered a new coded language to describe our sexual and romantic interests without actually having to name them. In 2005, during my fourth of a 5-year college degree, I put together my first Facebook profile, carefully curating the songs and books and films that painted the best picture of my uniquely subversive and interesting self. With the fear and exhilaration that only the internet, with its new promise of anonymity and opportunity, could bring, I arrived at the interested in section. I had 3 options: men, women, or men and women. I hesitated. My heart raced. I felt dizzy and my vision blurred at the edges. I clicked the 3rd option. For a few minutes, I panicked, my fingers hovering above the mouse, ready to change it. But eventually I moved my hand away. I sat at my desk, alone in my room, and considered the implications of this little virtual box. The options it offered seem limited now, but it was liberating then. It allowed me to say what I wanted to say, to call myself what I was pretty sure I might be, without having to use the word for it. Thank you. I'll stop there.
You read from the essay that I was like really excited to talk about, so I'm very glad to hear that. Awesome. Yeah, I'm Krys Belc. Sorry, I think I got muted for a sec. My book is called The Natural Mother of the Child. It is coming out in June, and I'm going to read for the first time from an actual copy of the book. I'm going to read a very brief section from an essay called Wildlife. When your friends at work become pregnant, you come home and tell me everything. The boys are still half in their pajamas and they are running around the house yelling and scattering their toys as widely as they can. It is 8 in the morning and I am emptying the dishwasher and washing berries in a little colander, and I am cutting the kids' pancakes and trying to find Samson's lunchbox. It is under the couch. My eyes are closed at the breakfast table waiting for coffee to hit me. Nobody bother your dad before his first cup of coffee, you say. You are passing out plates and forks like playing cards. You want to talk about your pregnant friends, when they are due and what their partners are like and where they plan to give birth and whether they're sick. And what I never say is that I hate these conversations so much. At my CrossFit gym, there is another pregnant woman and every other woman wants to talk to her about their births. I make sure not to stand too close because I don't want to seem interested in their birth stories. Trying to look like I'm not listening only makes it worse. This is when I see flashes of the bathroom where I had Samson, of his slimy new head. He came out so sleepy he had to be roused to cry. He was saving energy, we said once we knew him. You told me you learned in nursing school that some women with dementia remember the day they gave birth with great clarity, even as everything around them crumbles. It has defined my life too. When I am around a pregnant person, I feel an emptiness where Samson used to be. A professor I respect deeply tells me she is pregnant, and I know it's irrational. I know it isn't fair, but the surprise on her face when I tell her about Samson hurts me. She doesn't seem repulsed, just surprised. Who would think? In that moment, I know I can never have my past and present at the same time. I hate having to explain how Samson and I are related. I don't want my life, his life, to be a surprise. Most of the time, I don't have to explain. No one asks, because who would think? Page is turning. In the campus gym, I lift weights and watch young men play basketball. I don't work out a lot here because the bathroom is in a locker room, down a long cinder block corridor, past communal showers. I'm still afraid of a place like that. You were at Lego Club at the public library with our boys, chatting, I'm sure, because you make friends easily. There is a policy that one must wear appropriate attire in this gym, except when one participates in shirts versus skins basketball. I watch 10 bodies moving and I long so painfully to have what they have, and yet, when we are all home again, you are brushing Samson's hair after his bath and he asks what hair is, and you say every part of us is made of cells. What is a cell, he says, and you say it is a building block. It has been well over 5 years, and I still stare at his body in awe that he came out of me. You have learned how to say the things about your births that avoid talking about Samson. With Sean, I pushed for over 3 hours. With Zizi, things were so quick, so smooth. Samson fades into the background, and you hope he will go unnoticed. I would rather have my own birth than be at one of yours any day. When Sean and Zizi were born, I was so tired of seeing you in pain, I could barely be happy. I am so much more comfortable with my own pain. When I must disclose that one of them is not mine, I say simply, he is not my genetic relative. Thanks.
That was great, Krys. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's a great honor to read with Krys and Melissa, both of their books I absolutely loved. Please pre-order and/or purchase as see fit. I'm going to read now from my forthcoming collection, I'm Not Hungry, But I Could Eat. It's a collection about bisexual and gay Puerto Rican men who are all fat. I opened the collection with a note that says, please note every narrator and protagonist in this collection is a bisexual Puerto Rican cub with the exception of one. In that story, the narrator is gay. So just have that image in mind. I'm going to read a story called That Version of You. I've been trying to feel more comfortable in my skin. Let go, man. Don't think it, do it. That's what everyone's been telling me. Not you, but everyone else. The club thumped with Brittany, Carly Rae, and Sia, and they all got my body loose. To feel this good on the dance floor requires space in my stomach. The last meal I ate, a bowl of Raisin Bran, a cup of oat milk, lapped up every drop so I'd have enough to hold on to without feeling weighed down. I'm starving, but this way I can keep up with you. Except you're doing the straight guy thing, again. You're bumping against any woman who gives you an opening and some who don't. I'm not intervening. I watched you drain an entire vodka Gatorade on the train into Manhattan, your stomach empty, and the last time I got involved, my nose made friends with the back of your hand. A guy approaches me to dance when Whitney comes on, and I will myself to stay cool about it. When he leads me to the dance floor, I spot a touch of gel on his eyebrows. I'm guessing it's meant to keep them in place, which I get on a practical level. We're all trying to tame the untamable. I smile, which elicits one from him, making his face look like sculpted wax when we step into the wrong lighting. And there's plenty of wrong lighting tonight. There's a good chance you're hooking up somewhere. I assumed before leaving the apartment that I'd end my night abandoned, cooling off in the backseat of a Lyft, fantasizing about taking your clippers to shave a clean stripe down the center of your skull while you sleep. We've joked in the past about you hating my guts and me wanting you dead. Some nights, this cuts closer to the truth. I dance a few songs with gelled eyebrows until LaRue starts up. Then he asks if I'd like a drink, which I do, but you're disappearing through the side door, and I know I should check on you. In the alley, you're kicking a dumpster, really laying into it. So now, tonight is more like that time in college when I found you on the floor of our common room in your boxers, hours after ditching me at a house party. You were eating cheesy bread from Domino's, which you'd recently told me I should stop eating because of the cholesterol. But when I knelt down to touch your shoulder and connected with your eyes, pink and glazed over from Everclear and Pepsi, you offered me a warm piece, the white cheese stretching away from the box like taffy. Tonight, I'm dealing with that version of you. You start going on about how women don't like shorter dudes, as if it's a fact, how it's all about your height, how your dance partner took off with a 6 foot tall guy, maybe taller, with good hair and nice jeans, and how could you ever expect to compete with someone like that? I've been hearing the same tale since we were both 19 and held toxic beliefs about what we thought women owed us. Anyway, you say, want to get some food? Gelled Eyebrows is behind me, waiting to be introduced. Before I can ask him his name, you kick the dumpster one more time and say, fuck it, there's a bodega a few blocks away from here. Gelled Eyebrows and I exchange a glance, his eyebrows in full slants of confusion. I clear my throat and think maybe I should take pity and let him go. But then I nod your way, and soon he's following me, following you. We stand in line at the bodega, our faces lobster red, hair soaked, shirts damp and yellowed under the low wattage fluorescent lights. Gloria Estefan's voice hovers around us, and I think maybe the rhythm is going to get us. We approach the front of the line, and I can almost taste the grease hissing on the griddle. I'm drooling, starved. I got my mind on bacon and globs of cream cheese doused in hot sauce. Gelled Eyebrow squints at the menu. I guess this is a bad time to tell you I'm vegan, he says, and you roll your eyes. I'm thinking about a salad, you say. Doesn't that sound nice? Your eyes are bloodshot now, and you're wavering with the rest of the crowd. I want to shove your face down onto the hot griddle, creating a beautiful sizzle. But no dressing, you add, though we didn't ask. I stopped messing with that shit like a month ago. More people pack in, and our noses almost touch the deli case. I'm keeping centered with my palm on the glass. Its grimy surface feels like our entire world. Stop there.
Now that I'm 100% sure we're all having a good time, I'm going to open this to our three writers for a little conversation and get it once again out of the way.
Who wants to go first? I guess I will because I'm speaking already. But thank you both for those readings. I feel like it's already a total honor to be on this panel, but like the greatest privilege of getting to be on it was getting to read these two books before they came out, which I'm really grateful for. I love them both. Please, everybody who's in attendance, pre-order them. You will not be disappointed. So when we were asked to do this panel, I was thinking about the title, Writing Queer Lives, and I've been thinking about that kind of since we started circling around this this event. And so I guess kind of what I'm curious about is like what that means to you both as writers. What does it mean to write queer life? I think for Krys, Krys Belc and I are both nonfiction writers, and Christopher, your book is fiction, but so I imagine that the intricacies are a little different, but like, what does it mean to write queer life, your own, others? What does that look like?
Yeah, I guess I can answer, or it's interesting because I feel like the oldest story in this collection is like 5 years old now, and it was probably the first story that I allowed myself to write about an openly queer character. And I came out when I was, God, I don't remember if it was 24 or 26. Those are two different numbers. I want to say 20, like after college, I came out to friends, and then at like 26 or so, I came out to my family. And so to write openly queer as I was sort of navigating that identity and what that meant for me, and exploring it through fiction, it's been about discovery, and it's been about channeling confusion, but also channeling loneliness and feelings of isolation. I think this collection is that journey in book form, and I sort of like look back and I'm like, oh, I wish I had sort of focused more on like joy, which I think is in the book. But I think for me, joy in queerness was start like coming later in my journey, I guess. And now I feel like I'm on the other side of, I'm like exploring that more in my own life and hopefully in my own writing.
I feel like I feel exactly the same way. Like I like the book that I produced, but I wouldn't call it dark. I just think that it has like a searchingness to it because it's about sort of like the deep abyss of an unknown. Like I was in a time of my life where I was really figuring shit out, and I decided to write about it in a time that wasn't too far removed from the events that were happening. So now even just having like 3 years distance, 4 years distance from some of the things that I wrote, I have like a different almost lens to put on them. And I'm like, it wasn't so bad. And like now that I like sleep and my kids are older and I feel like I have like a more regular life, I don't feel quite so like bleak about it. But yeah, I was thinking, Melissa, as you were reading, because like I said, this was an essay that I was thinking about coming into this panel. I really admire that. Of course, there is like a searchingness to that essay, and a lot of it is about like, I'm not sure how I feel about not only my own identity, but also what these words mean and whether I want to use them and how I want to use them. But you do just kind of like say shit and tell stuff plainly. And I'm a very like circular writer where like nothing actually, it's like a very elliptical. And I consider that like part of the queerness of my own writing. But I just think that you have like a muscular and straightforward way of just like diving into these really difficult questions that I feel like I'm dancing around from like 20 yards behind. So I was very interested in how we're all kind of writing about this like in-betweenness, but with a very different like distance from it.
Yeah, totally. I think it's really funny that you see my writing as like being sort of a direct shot at some of these things, because I definitely feel like I'm more, I mean, maybe I'm saying things directly, but then I'm like immediately contradicting myself, and like just kind of digging into those contradictions and questions. But I just like, I was nodding vigorously at both of your responses because it feels so true for me too, that the writing of Tomboy Land was so much, especially that essay Tomboy, was like very much a searching, and like after many years of experiences feeling like I needed to write about it, not least to try to figure it out, which is what so many of my essays are, like just I have a question or something I can't figure out, so I'm trying to write into it and around it to try to better figure it out. But I mean, that essay I probably is one of the most recent of the collection. And I still think I wrote that in like, I think I started it in 2016 or 2017. So now, several years removed from it, there's some of it I read and like, oh baby, and also like, oh, that's sweet and naive, or like, or simple, too simplified, or I wish I, had gotten into the intricacies of this better, but I couldn't have at the time because I didn't, it was still, I was a late bloomer in terms of my own coming out, such as it was or wasn't, and really paying attention to language and labels and things like that. So yes, journey still going, more joy in the future, hopefully. I think.
Since we're all talking about like, yeah, all of our books are sort of like this culmination of searching, and yet we're all continuing to search and revise our own feelings about our identities, or even like maybe like what we think about like queerness as a umbrella or an abstract term, or even like even if it's like, I don't know, real, like what does it actually mean? I think, going into this panel about like writing queer life, I think something I've been learning in my own like writing is that like nothing is quite fixed. Like I've been looking at these stories and sort of, I think, and Melissa, when you like were reading about like the label of like bisexual, which is like what I grappled on with when I first came out, and like it was important to me that the characters in this book sort of had that identity, because it's one that is often erased. But I feel like myself, I'm drifting more towards a vaguer queerness and less of this like fixed identity. And I'm just, I feel like, I wonder what both of you think about that idea of like revising, and insofar as like queerness is revising your own like attitude towards yourself and people around you.
Yeah, constant revision. I love that. I love, like I feel like I'm always thinking about fluidity and changing, and nothing being a fixed point, but like in terms of like, just because we're always talking about craft, thinking about identity as this constant process of revision. I think about that a lot, especially, I get, when I was doing a lot of readings from this book, I was getting the question about, that was kind of circling around this larger question of like, what happens if you change your mind, or if some like experiential thing shifts. And I'm always just sort of like a little confounded by that question, because we're all always shifting, and we're, our ideas, and I think if we're living life right, our ideas and understandings are always shifting and changing and getting more complex, I think, and nuanced. And so, there's a essay in the book about not wanting children. And ever since I wrote that book, I've been having more of an actual conversation about having children, and like what that might look like, and what, whether or not I would ever consider carrying, if I could, or, and that seems almost in conflict with the voice in that essay. So, we're constantly shifting, and our ideas and desires are constantly changing. And it's just, I think we keep writing to keep chronicling ourselves and our experiences and ideas as we change, I think.
It's been really helpful for me when people have put my work in conversation with other, especially queer writers, not like literally talking to them, but just like, hey, this is a book that reminded me of like some of the stuff that you're working out. And even if I ended up like disagreeing with some of it, or some of it, like a lot of queer stuff, I'll be like, yeah, I'm on board. Oh wait, it's actually slightly transphobic. So like, I'm not really down with that anymore. Especially like, I don't know, a couple books that are about like butch pregnancy, or kind of like more masculine women giving birth, will be like, like a little knocking on people who identify as trans masculine, whatever. But I feel like I can still gain community out of like reading some of these things. And I'm trying to approach my own work with the same grace, where I'm like, I want to be in conversation with myself. I didn't write a book to only write one book. This isn't like I'm in my 70s and it's my vanity memoir. Like, I'm young and I have a lot of life ahead of me and hopefully a lot more experiences. And it's okay if I disagree with myself. I'll just like be in conversation with myself as part of like building this queer conversation. And that's been like, I think, a helpful lens for me to deal with the fact that I've like grown up since some of the ideas that I had while I was writing.
We do have a couple of questions showing up here in the Q&A. One of them is, was there any book that any of you read in early life? And early life, I think, is an interesting modifier to this question, that was formative to you in exploring your identity.
I don't know what the definition of early life is, but if it's childhood, the book that I found most inspiring was definitely Matilda. I like felt very much like outsidery and was like, wow, a story about someone who like leaves the traditional family structure and goes on an adventure that also involves evil, like felt very like very vibes that I needed. And I think that that is something that is like, I mean, Roald Dahl sucks, but there are queer books that I feel like have a similar vibe to them. Obviously, like they have different craft and they're for adults and there's like sex in them and whatever. But like when I read like Giovanni's Room, I'm like, it's about someone who's in a traditional family structure, who's leaving the structure and going on an adventure that involves danger. Like that, I don't know, craving that story was something that like took me from childhood into like a queer adulthood.
Yeah, second Matilda. I've thought about this a lot. I don't think that I ever read anything when I was young that resonated in terms of like sexuality. Certainly, that really wasn't, I didn't read books that contained anything about queer identity, at least in any kind of non-abstract way until much later in my young adolescence. And then I was like, oh, interesting. But definitely like the tomboy, narratives always resonated with me. Like the girl that, was always mistaken for a boy and was doing all of the attendant tomboy activities, running around and fighting and climbing trees and all of that. Like To Kill a Mockingbird, also, to name another problematic but highly influential book for me when I was young. That was one where I was like, I am Scout, there I am. So that was a big one.
Yeah, I think I don't know if there's anything that was like explicitly I could connect to in a way about queerness when I was younger, but I latched onto a series of unfortunate events, to name another problematic author. But for the reasons that I think there was a deep loneliness in those children, and there was a deep, isolation, and it's about finding family in those around you and those who are, I mean, it's not quite found family because they're siblings, but even it's them against the world, right? And I think I really held on to that notion of keeping the people you love dearly, keeping them close with you, even if you're apart. And I think that's something that has guided me into my adult life. And then it wasn't until much later when I read We the Animals by Justin Torres, which I think is a book that cracked open a lot for me. And then you start looking back on your childhood and you're like, wait a minute. Yeah.
When I hear your answers, I think, this isn't about queerness. These people just love books.
Matilda is so queer. I'm sorry. Like I have to, like, it's so queer. Like the Trunchbull is like this evil butch who like is a very prominent figure in, I'm a K through 12 teacher. So like there's always that like mean butch teacher in the elementary school that like everyone's talking shit about all the time. And like Miss Honey is like this femme recluse and they're like in the same family. So they like can't talk about it. Like I've analyzed this book to death because I've been like, what is it about that book that has such a hold on me? And like it's so queer. That's just my take on it.
That's a very, very good point.
I also want to make sure I address Silas's comment in the chat that yeah, right, okay, Chris already did it, but I was a huge Boxcar Children fan, and yes, obviously, like what, again, I think, you know, I was reading these narratives that like if someone tells me later in life like, oh yeah, that book was super queer, it's like, oh right, of course it was. Building your own family and life structure inside a boxcar, you know. Yeah, thanks for bringing that one up.
We have another question. As authors who write queer lives, how have you had to navigate the intersectionality of queerness, sexuality, gender, race, and so on? Yeah, think about that one for a second.
I guess I'll go first. The 25 words or less. I feel like my whole book is kind of about a certain level of intersectionality in that it's very much about gender, sexuality, and class, and the ways that those things, for me personally, like I said before, are really kind of inextricably bound, and how one informs the other, and complicates another, and how I can't, you know, for a lot of people, I hear sometimes, you know, this thing, which is very true for a lot of people, that gender identity and sexuality are these completely different things. Like, don't always refer to them like they are, you know, necessarily in a package, but for me, they kind of are, in that, you know, the way that I'm perceived in the world is, you know, the assumptions people make about me, and the perceptions that they have about me are because I look a certain way, you know, and the signifiers I wear, and the fact that I'm mask of center, and you know, so, and how class, like when you have access to education and theory and things like that, your understanding of identity by nature, I think, is often more complex and more nuanced. And because I didn't have that, it took me a really long time to figure some stuff out, and I'm still figuring it out. And I still feel wildly uncomfortable in a lot of spaces because I didn't have early access to some of those resources. And my book, I think, you know, is also definitely about whiteness, about growing up in a very white part of Wisconsin, and what rural working class whiteness looks like and means, you know, and also narratives of working class whiteness on Indigenous land, and being sort of these narratives of work, and, you know, this is our land and our toil and stuff that I have heard my farm family generations therein, I've heard them use words like that, and like, but not paying attention to the fact that, you know, we're white, and that this is not, this land that we work and that we call ours is not ours. So that's kind of, those are all the things that I was engaging with in my book.
Yeah, I think for this book in particular, you know, there's a lot about hookup culture and dating, and, you know, in my own life, I'm navigating that from the perspective of being bisexual and like how people respond to that kind of identity, the stigma that comes with it, being a a bigger person of size in a queer dating scene, that sort of like, especially like, in like a gay dating scene where like thinness or like, like twink identity is sort of privileged and desired, or like muscular jocks and sort of falling into neither of those categories, and brushing up against whiteness because that's also desired. So I think, as I navigate those spaces in my everyday life, I'm also sort of exploring them in fiction, because really, I don't know, I sometimes say that I don't write essays because I can't write essays that well, I write fiction. So I'm truly just like taking those ideas and like trying to explore them without relying too heavily on the truth, I guess. So those are some of the dynamics. And from a fiction writing perspective, while writing some of these stories, some of my narrators aren't named, and I've had readers sometimes in early drafts ask me, they're like, they couldn't place the gender of the reader or of the narrator. And in my head, I was like, I mean, I'm writing from what I perceive as like a very cis male perspective, but that doesn't always land, and that I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I necessarily even care that like somebody might read a story and be confused about what the gender of any of the narrators is. I think partly that's why I included the note, but I sort of, through writing this, stopped caring so much about how I was being perceived, I guess, because they're all me. I mean, it's not autofiction, but they're all me.
Yeah, I don't know that I have like a whole lot to add that other folks haven't already touched on. I feel like Melissa, I have a body that's very coded as queer. And I've had like a, kind of transformation from like having people call me certain names to having people call me certain other names. And I think a lot of like, the book is about what it means to like have remained in the same I have like a very traditional nuclear family structure, and I got married very young, and I mean, young for my class basically, and had children on the younger end for my class, but around the average age of like when Americans have children. It's just like perceived differently when you're middle class and educated. But yeah, a lot of it has been about like how the perception of what my family is has changed, and how it's kind of like only my fault. Like it's my fault. Like it, like my partner's a cis woman. She basically looks exactly the way she did when I met her so many years ago. We've been together for 15 years, and I've just like tried every iteration of like butch, femme, on hormones, off hormones, dressing like super male, like trying to sound butch, being okay with the fact that I like have this super queer sounding voice, and like people call me names sometimes, like just kind of like I'm doing all this stuff and everyone's just like along for the ride with me. So that has been like a complicating thing. And I think when you're talking about like where my book might fit in, I think it is entering a conversation that is like a very middle class white woman's conversation about like what it means to be a mother and a caregiver. Like that conversation is being pushed on, I think, by working class women and poor women who are trying to like write into that space, and by like women of color who are trying to write into that like motherhood writing space. And I'm kind of like approaching it from the like queer kind of dude space. Like, can I also join this conversation that we're trying to like problematize, because it's not like 2009 with like all the white women Mormon bloggers. Like we need more voices. So I think that genre is like diversifying a lot, and I hope that I'm like on one of the edges trying to like break into it.
I really like the way you said that we need more voices, and not just necessarily more sister wives, but more voices in general. And that kind of brings us to another question that is disjointed in a certain way, but I really understand where it's coming from. One of our audience finds that in submitting her own work to literary journals who are looking for queer stories, sometimes her writing is to herself doesn't feel queer enough. And I'm going to add to this that there's, a certain like monolithic gay and lesbian idea, particularly in literature. Do you ever grapple to return to, okay, well, questions answered then. Do you ever grapple with the feeling of when you're writing about the queer experience or a queer experience or your queer experience? And what do you do about it?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So much of my book is about not feeling queer enough. And I have a book out in the world that is on queer lists. It's on like a best queer book from Oprah magazine, and I still feel like an imposter when I call it a queer book. And I don't know if that's ever going to go away fully for me, but I absolutely feel it all the time, and I think that's part of the journey too. Acknowledging and validating my own story as being queer. And getting comfortable saying that and really believing it and kind of trying to quiet that voice inside me that's like, oh, because I'm a bisexual person, and like that somehow makes me less queer, because of course I've been hearing that my whole life and have internalized it and for a long time believed it and sometimes still believe it. So it's always a thing that I grapple with. And funny story, someone reached out just in terms of bisexual erasure, which I write about a ton in this book. But I was recently, someone contacted me on the DMs and Twitter to ask if I could send promo materials for my book because they wanted to consider it for an award. And I was like, okay, cool. Weird way to contact me, but thanks. I'm honored. Yeah, I'll, have my publicist send some stuff along. And they're like, cool. We want to make sure that it gets included as under consideration for the Lesbian Nonfiction Award. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I wrote back and I was like, I mean, that's great. I'm honored, but I don't identify as a lesbian, right? And this isn't a lesbian book. And if you put it under the umbrella of lesbian book, a lot of lesbian folks are going to be pissed, and they wrote back and they were like, oh yeah, no, sorry. We fit bisexual under the category of lesbian. And I was like, okay, cool. I don't know where to go from there, but that was just a recent example.
I started writing nonfiction because I could not stop writing straight characters. I kept writing this fiction and I was like, God, this is just some like dry ass cis straight nonsense again. What am I doing? I feel like I had barriers to my imagination and I don't feel that way in nonfiction. So I think that's why I am a memoirist and why I am a nonfiction writer, because I feel like it's hard in fiction because I feel like I have to put all these signs and symbols in the work, unless it's like Chris, like you were saying with names. I'm like, but how do they know that it's a queer person? Especially because I feel like things are confusing in life and you don't always know that something's queer or whatever. But in nonfiction, I'm like, well, I'm queer. So everyone knows that. And if it's true and it happened in my life, even if it has nothing, there's no trans content, whatever, I'm like, it's queer because I wrote it. And it makes me feel more legit. And I don't want that, but I do. And it helps me personally.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Chris, because some of the stories in the collection, it's about a friendship or relationship between a man and a woman, and there's really no explicit reference to sexuality other than the very intimate connection between these two people. And in short fiction, I feel, and especially if it's leaning more towards flash fiction, right? It would be so laborious and tedious to be Malcolm, the bisexual, walked into a room when I as the writer know it informs like this character's life, but if I'm analyzing a specific relationship, it might not come up in the way that like in real life it might not really come up in like in the mechanics of it. And I sort of had to learn how to just sort of, I mean, again, going back to my stupid note at the, at the start of the book, which maybe it came from a point of like defensiveness, but also I think, you know, I wanted readers to know and not question and not look at any of these like doubted, because to me all these characters, no matter if it's, you know, explicitly stated or otherwise, like are queer, and they're queer no matter if they're not, there's nothing about sex or dating, they're always queer, and I feel that I'm trying to keep that in mind about myself. You know, I feel like there's no way that I'm not writing from a queer sensibility, even if I don't fully understand what that sensibility is.
This was intensely helpful because the next 3 questions are all variations on this theme. Who is your audience when you're writing? Who are you writing for? Is it some younger version of yourself sometimes, or is there somebody else that you have in mind when you're composing these stories, these essays?
I think had you asked me 2 years ago, I would have been like, I'm writing for anyone who wants to be seen, who is like queer Latinx, and like I guess I am, but I think selfishly I'm writing mostly for myself. I think selfishly the stories I'm writing are explorations of just feelings and like again like personal anxiety and sadness and loneliness in the way that like I sort of navigate it in my life. And while of course I want the book to reach other queer Latinx, it's not like disingenuous, like, but I think I can't think about that as, because then it's like, I think that introduces questions of, am I doing this right? Is it Latinx enough? Like, which is a question that I don't think there's a real answer to. Is it Puerto Rican enough? Is like a question that I would come up against too. That's not, this isn't the panel necessarily for that. But I think if I thought about specifically an audience like that, it would be very debilitating in my own writing.
I struggle with the idea of like a robust queer readership because I know that queer people have children, but children do not exist in fiction or nonfiction written by queer people that I read or that tends to like win awards or stand the test of time. Like I know obviously there are many exceptions and there are great queer writers writing for children and about children, but like adult novels and memoirs that are queer, often like there is no child in the work for any reason at all, only as an idea to be dismissed sometimes. So I struggle like with that a little bit, where I'm kind of like, there's stuff that is like about queerness that I think queer people would like jive with, and I don't ever try to like explain. I don't even make attempts to explain like my gender identity or like who I'm attracted to or my queerness or my sexuality. Like I don't really like engage with that. So I think like when I'm writing about that stuff, I'm like, queer people get it, other people can try to get it, and I don't really care if they do or not, that's fine. But I do sometimes feel like a barrier where I'm like, do queer people even care about this? Like, I don't know. There's no evidence to support that they do, really. So I find that in my work, in this book a lot, I write in direct address, not only to like my partner and like a letter style writing, but also to other people, to my mother, to my son. Like a lot of it is like in first person with direct address. And I find that that is a device that helps me feel like more comfortable, like playing with ideas and experimenting, because I'm like, I know these people and I know that they give a shit about like my thoughts. And when I'm writing, I'm sometimes like, is that a device that I then want to remove? But I ended up feeling like it really did like increase the intimacy of the work. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but it kind of blends the like audience and then craft question.
I love the direct address. Yeah, as with every answer, both of those answers resonated with me. I feel like my understanding of who I was writing this book for, who my perceived audience was, I think changed as I was writing it. And when I started writing the more sort of the queerer essays in the book, I think that I was really thinking a lot about the people in my life, my extended family, even my immediate family, my extended family, some people I had grown up with, like the people from home, biological family, not the chosen ones, not my queer community, but like essentially the straight people from Wisconsin and the Midwest in my life who I love and who I think love me, and wanting them to understand and like wanting them to get it and wanting them to love me still, despite now knowing all of these things that to them seem, devious or somehow, whatever, any spectrum of like non-approval. I think I had that in mind a lot as I wrote, and in retrospect, that was super toxic for me. And I won't do that in the future, because then it came out, and I was just like, I felt more vulnerable about what they would think, and had some interactions with people that were really hurtful and really disappointing, and that really kind of like unmoored me. And so, going forward, I know that I won't write for them. I will continue to write more for myself, because there was definitely part of this book that was for me. And I think most of it, in retrospect, now that I look back, I know it was for me. And a lot of that in particular was that, I have read a lot of books written by sort of butch cisgendered women, most of whom identify as lesbians, and that's awesome and has been super influential for me. But I realized at a certain point that I had not read a book by someone who had my experiences, who was, writing from like butch bisexual woman-ish creature. And I wanted that, I wanted to write about that particular experience, and I wanted to do that for myself. And I also wanted, obviously, to connect to other people who had those experiences as well.
In a way, it almost feels like we planned this, but I feel like you just keep setting up the next question so well. Right. Swing that bat. You've definitely played baseball before. In addition to thinking about who your readership is when you're writing, do you think about who it's going to impact? The people that you haven't foreseen yet, but who will be picking up your book, who will encounter your book as the first example for them of queer writing?
I really have my quiet, that's not quiet because I'm making it a public thought, is that I'm like hoping that people pick up the book wanting to read like a straightforward memoir where someone like tells them things that they don't know about, and like instead it is like a formally, I wouldn't call it experimental, but it's not straightforward in form. And I hope that there are people who are interested in this story who then kind of discover new craft, because I like craft a lot, and I feel like sometimes I'm like get a little tired talking about like identity and where do I fit in. I'm like, I actually just really, I like to write, I like to make things, I like to experiment with when I'm writing. That's fun, and I want to like get to talk about that, and I want people to be like, wow, I didn't know memoirs could do these things, like I've never read something that looks like this. Like that was what like that idea really excites me.
Same. I also was really hoping that some of the formal things in my book would connect with people, namely that, I write often from I use a personal narrative to like explore other people's stories. And so much of my book is about other people's stories. It's not just me. And, you know, when a book is marketed, it's often out, it's beyond the control of the author. And when my book was coming out, it was really marketed based on that essay, Tomboy. And that is one essay in a large collection that does a lot of different formal things, namely like interview and reportage. And I really get into like kind of micro profiles of some of the people that I'm writing about. So I was really hoping that that would connect with people who are interested in craft and what nonfiction can do, and like this marriage of personal essay and reportage and research and interview. And it's been taught in a lot of classrooms because of that. So I'm really, really pumped about that. It's maybe the best part.
I think a personal goal of mine is for people to pick up on the humor in the book. That's always what I hope, like more than anything. That I think sometimes I worry that my work is too skewed towards like sincerity or like somberness or melancholy, and I definitely think those are like operating modes in my writing and also in my life. But I hope that there is, you know, everyone's talking about craft, and I think that's one of the things related to craft that I hope lands and I hope people pick up on. And if not in this book, in future books, that's my goal. But I think that's like what I hope people who, you know, I think the title suggests something about that, I think. But yeah, that's sort of my own personal thing.
I have to tell you, Chris, when I read the first story in your book, I laughed out loud the whole time. It was just so funny. And I don't want to spoil it because the end is just, I just laughed out loud the whole time. So you got me. So funny.
Thank you.
That's a
I
good
also
suggestion. But go on. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just gonna say I also found it really funny. Like I had read some of your work just around the internet before I read the book, and I was like, I love this. It's earnest, but with a sense of humor. Like I like that it is both of those things. I think that that neither one would hit without the other. And it just like is very inviting and wonderful.
Well, thank you. I feel like I have to return the love, but like, but also, you know, Melissa, your book, like talking about form, right? And even thinking like your book, Krys, which is told in a way that I love, that sort of like circular and non-linear way. Like that's what I loved about your book, Krys, and like Melissa, you're just like seeing what you could do within the realm of nonfiction. Like I think both of you are such strong nonfiction writers, because it's not just a simple this happened and this happened, this happened. There feels like you're able to pull from the larger world. And they were very, I felt like I was learning as I was also enjoying the actual narratives. Like I was like underlining things and being like, oh, this is a good technique. So I feel like, yeah, as far as craft, I was blown away from both of your books.
So another question came in. Are there any lessons you've learned in the process of writing your work that you'll take into your next book? Yeah, chew on that for a second. And that you can identify right now before a live studio audience.
I mean, I think we've already hit on this, so I won't belabor it. But for me, definitely, I learned to think less about what people are going to think, you know, and trust myself and trust the process and trust that the book is going to find the people that it needs to find or that need to find it, and that everybody else, you know, actually doesn't matter. That's been a big one for me.
I just feel emboldened to do weird things. Like I did weird things and I thought that the book wouldn't happen, but it's now a book. So apparently doing weird things does sometimes result in a book happening. Like when I was really in the deep artistic part of the process, I was like, this is so fun. I like the way this looks. This is meaningful to me. I like some of the writing I'm doing, and I'm publishing like little tiny pieces of it. And I'm like, but when I put it together, like it's kind of odd. I don't know if people are gonna want this, but like I think it's okay. I think that people are smart and readers are smart and they can read things that are not like in a traditional narrative structure telling a linear story and they can be okay and be with me. So I feel emboldened writing new things that are perhaps even more empowered in their strangeness.
Yeah, I think to Chris's point, I learned to sort of enjoy my own bullshit in writing and just sort of lean into it. And that sort of, I feel like a lot of writers talk about every writer has their own obsessions and their own things that will come out in their work, whether or not you intend them to. And like when you notice them, it's kind of fun. But yeah, to not be afraid of them and to not think about whether or not they will resonate. Because I feel like if it matters to you and if you care about it, then it has the potential to do like other people, for other people to care about it and connect with it.
That is all of the questions we've got in the Q&A for the moment. Do any of you have anything you'd like to bring to each other's attention? Originally, this was billed as a bit of a conversation, and I kind of, waylaid that with all of the questions that were pouring in. But Melissa, did you have any particular thoughts that you wanted to address with Christopher or Krys?
Honestly, the things that I had prepared other than that first question have already been addressed mostly. I mean, I would love to talk a little bit more about craft because I can always talk about craft. But I also don't want to like get too nerdy for our audience here.
This is a literary festival.
No, we should do it.
Yeah.
I really want to know, Krys, I want you to talk about your story. Here's the situation and like the white space in that story, because it just really like popped in there, toward, I think, the back like 2/3 of the collection. And there's so much white space in it. And that was like a new technique that you were using. So I want to know more about like why then, why there, why that story.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So for anyone who hasn't read it, because it published in JMWW, and there was white space, but not as much white space as you can pull off in an actual book, which in the actual story, it's maybe like 10 pages, but it's a very short story. After every section, which is only about like a paragraph or a couple paragraphs, there's just a bunch of white space, and it sort of jumps around in time. And I think that story is about sort of like the dissolution of a friendship that sort of blurs the line of like friendship and more intimate relationship. And I feel like when things like that come to an end, it's not so much about like point A to point B to point C. It's about the flurry of memories that sort of flood in, and I wanted to capture that in the text. Like the narrator can point to, here's the situation, and here's this time, and here's this time, and it sort of floats around. So it was very much trying to see if I can like replicate that feeling in the text, and that's where the white space came in. And then my editor had the idea of like, oh, these all need to be on individual pages, which I think makes it so much better. And she's a poet, so like that feels like pushing it into that direction, and I think it's better for it.
I just want to add that I also had a poet editor who I think that I was like a little bit afraid that, when I write essays, they're often in sort of vignette structure. So I am the utilizer of the little asterisk between each little, each small vignette. And when we were working on the book, she was like, what if we removed the vignette, the asterisks and just did a drop cap for every section? And I was like, whoa, that's a lot of drop caps. I was like a little bit like weirded out by that decision, but I really ended up loving it. It's like each vignette functions like a micro chapter. Poets.
I think it's just amazing because I think queer people and queer literature are often like not taking up space. So I love seeing like queer writers just like taking up entire pages with like this little thought. I'm like, yes, you like take that page. Like, we need this. I really, really appreciate that. Like, it has a strength to it.
Yeah, I love that. And your book obviously does that too, Krys. I love the, especially like the use of sonograms, and then, like block of text and then space. And I feel like space is really interesting. There's so much lives in that space. And everybody, I think every reader comes to it differently and gets something else out of it. But I love the idea of queer writers taking up more space. My essays are like 10,000 words. So I'm like, nobody needs a 10,000 word essay. And then like my favorite thing is when people are like, oh yes, we do. Make it 12.
I really like that though. They're hard, that those length essays, I feel I don't write them. Like, I obviously can't sustain a thought for 12,000 words, but they're like hard to place, So then if you get a book, you have the power to be like, yes, I'm going to have this like super sustained engagement with something. Like, I love when collections of essays or short stories have like the monsters in them. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and like thinking about like your essays, Melissa, like to go back to form, like, the decision to interview people and like create these mini profiles, for example, like at what point in the writing process does that come in? Is that something you entered with, like, I'm going to interview these people and then I'm going to take it? Or you sort of like, as you were exploring your ideas, you're like, I need to bring in these outside voices and I don't need to bring it in like in narrative text, so I can disrupt it. And I'm just very curious about how you arrived at that.
Yeah, it was definitely, this book was a process of like 10 years of work. So some of the oldest essays in the book, I wrote, and a couple of them I published in like 2011, 2010, 2011. And so when I was putting this book together and I was trying to figure out kind of which essays that I wanted to include in the book, I chose a few older ones that, particularly what set this off was the first essay in the book, which is called The Finger of God. And it's about this tornado, F5 tornado that destroyed a small town next to the town where I grew up in Wisconsin. And I had written this essay, and it got published in Prairie Schooner in like 2017 or 18. And it was pretty straight up personal essay. It was my story about this tornado that I did not live through. I was 1 year old when it hit. But the story was really about like storytelling and how narratives change and are passed down, and mythology and things like that. So that's what the essay had been about. And when I decided that it was going to be in this book, I was working on it, sort of revising it, updating it a little bit. And I was, suddenly realized that I couldn't write this. I couldn't publish this essay in this book without, really taking a deep dive into the actual event and talking to the people who had lived through it. That it really wasn't doing any service, or especially any new service, since it had already been published as an essay, if I didn't go back to the town and talk to the people who had been there. So I literally did that. I just went back to Wisconsin, and as I was sort of like veering very close to the deadline, the manuscript deadline, when I had to turn it into my editor. I had like 6 weeks left. And I was like, I need to go talk to some people who lived in Barneveld through the storm. And because I grew up in a very small town, because this town is very small, everybody knows everybody. And I asked my parents, who asked our next door neighbors, and they were like, oh yeah, do you know blah, blah, blah at the feed mill? And do you know, Sue? And, her mom lives in Mount Horeb, and whatever, all of these like intersections. So I interviewed all these folks over the course of a week. And kind of took this personal essay that I had as part one, and then I spent a bunch of time transcribing these interviews. And as I was doing like the actual manual work of transcription, I was able to identify what parts of these stories intersected with my own, which ones diverged, and isn't that interesting how when we're talking about the same story, they take on different life depending on who's telling them. So I kind of structured it in 3 parts. So it was sort of my personal kind of origin story with this tornado, which is really what I think of this tornado as, like my personal origin story. And then part 2 is interviewing and talking to these folks. And I'm a character on the page during those interviews. I'm narrating in a kind of new journalistic style, if that's even a thing anymore, but sitting in the booth with the person and talking about like what we're doing in the booth as we're having the conversation, my reaction to her revelations. And then kind of part 3 is I sort of move into kind of what those revelations meant to my understanding of this story. So it was a really cool process, and I loved it. And my background is in kind of first person reportage. I used to write for an alt weekly in Madison, Wisconsin, and those were the kinds of pieces I wrote. So I have a lot of fun with that. I love bringing in dialogue and scene setting into, a piece that's already existing kind of on its own. And then 2 other essays in the book, I decided would take that form too, because I wasn't interested enough in my own ideas and questions about these big things like guns and parenthood. I wanted to talk to a bunch of different people about those experiences. That was a long answer. Sorry.
It was a really great answer. And it also made me want to ask you, Krys, like, I know you mentioned some of the snippets from the book had been published before, right? And sort of when you came to the or were you sort of like, I've been writing about this experience and I'm going to bring them together and then I'm going to fill in? Or I'm curious about the filling in and sort of like where you wrote into reading over what you already had, etc., and like that part of the process.
Yeah, so the book has 6 sections. I think technically I would describe it as a memoir in essays, which is like a novel in stories. It is not an essay collection because there are definitely like sections that could not stand alone and do not stand up to scrutiny like in the way that essay collection pieces do. Like they're not supposed to, they're just their own thing and they don't make sense without other things in the book. So like I had published 3 of the sections as standalone essays in like earlier forms. And they were like kind of about different things, but also kind of not about different things. And I had published some of the other sections. Like I identify very strongly as like a flash nonfiction writer. I've published a lot of like 500-word essays, 750-word essays. That's something that I feel like is like my A+ game. But I kept writing about the same shit. So I was like, this is like, it's all the same thing. So I started trying to like see how I could make those things more of like a project. So I did do a lot of like, you guys talked about having poet editors. I decided that I would teach myself Adobe InDesign And like while I was writing, because I was like, fuck Microsoft Word. Every time I hit enter, everything gets ruined. So I became like a freak about page control, and I became obsessed with like the page as a unit and not thinking about things as like sections or essays. I was just like, it's about pages, and I'm gonna have like 200 pages, and I'm gonna have total control of everyone, and they're all moving parts. So I ended up like scrambling a lot of stuff. And I had like color, because it's InDesign, so you could do literally anything. So I was like color coding stuff. Like I was really kind of just like trying to make all the themes go together, but it was like extremely solitary work, that a lot of which was not writing words, right? Like it was a lot of like highlighting things and color coding them because they actually belong in this section, and just like moving and moving and moving, which is so, now I'm like, it's not even in, there's no temporal order to the thing. So it like wasn't about that. At the time, it was about other like, when do themes come out? When do they come back? When is like, because there's like characters, because it's a memoir. So it's like, when is my mom in it? When is my dad in it? And like, how does this all kind of like make a sense, not like the regular sense that we want out of our work? So yeah, it was very much like, I was looking at a lot of things that I had written and published, and a lot of stuff didn't have a place because it wasn't about my obsession with the fact that I had a baby in 2013, which is like that's the scope of this book. And some of it, it's not actually like about that, but it is to me about like that and what it means in my life. But yeah, I had to start thinking of it like as a book long before like it made any sense or deserved to be printed or any of that, because that helped me like understand how to kind of put it together in a way that you might put together like a family album out of a stack of photographs that you have like in a box. It's like, you can put them in temporal order. You can be like, I'm going to start in 1987 and I'm going to go through to 1990, and that's all the photos in this book. Or you can be like, I'm going to do whole family photos, and then I'm going to do school pictures, and then I'm going to do sports pictures. So I kind of like had to come up with schemes that were more like the second option.
I didn't want to jump in there. Oh, good. I'm not on mute. For a second, I was like, maybe I am. I didn't want to jump in there while you were going, Krys, but you mentioned their own thing. And that's actually something that I was looking for very much from this panel. As I mentioned before, this, monolithic idea of gay literature, this monolithic idea of lesbian literature. And each of you are very much bringing your own thing to this conversation. And I think that, speaks very, very much to the idea of having, a fluidity, certainly, but also just as many possible voices as there can be made available in one place. And we are coming to the end of the session. So if there's anything further you all wanted to jump into in the last 5 minutes, I'm here for it. We're having a great time.
This is like the question that you're never supposed to ask, but I love both of your work so much that I am curious what you're working on now. Now that your books are almost out, this is a good way to frame this. Like, one of the best pieces of advice I got when I was putting my book out was like, as soon as you turn it in and it's like becoming a book, make sure you're working on something else so that you're not obsessing over this thing. And that ended up being the most useful piece of advice I had. And I ended up writing a novel, but well, right. It was a surprise to me. But I'm so curious what you're both working on, even if it's just like exercise, distraction, what projects you've got.
That was like a gender reveal all of a sudden. There was a novel all of a sudden.
There's a novel, mute.
I also, I'm trying to make the pivot to novel length work. And I think while writing this collection for so long, I was on the submission grind, that I'm sort of enjoying this space of not having anything submittable, not submitting anything, and just like, head empty, anxiety's gone, just living with like this freedom. I think what as the collection was sort of going, I was, and I knew it was like going to be a book. I think I missed having just the space with like myself and the page and not worrying about, you know, submissions, readership, and all of that. So it's slow going, but novel, I will say that. And I can't wait. I hope to read yours one day.
Here's hoping.
I am decidedly not writing a novel right now. It's been a really hard time. I know a lot of folks here are in Philly. I live in Philly. I work at the Children's Hospital in a 9-to-5. And I've been at home with my children for the whole pandemic. They like just recently started going back to school in person. So it's been a really creatively difficult time. So you asked if there were exercises that we're working on, and there is one. I have been writing about, so like when I was working on my memoir, it needed some fleshing out in like later editing stages. And every time I sat down to write like a scene that needed to be there that wasn't, I kept writing about cooking and baking. Like I was just like, I love to eat. I love to bake. What do I think about when I think about like myself? I'm in the kitchen. That's why I'm like my mom. That's what motherhood, blah, blah, blah. That was part of like the theme of the book. So I've been trying to write about cooking. And every night I take notes on what I cooked that day, because I cook all meals consumed by all beings who are living in my home are prepared by me. That is like my purview. So I'm just kind of like thinking through labor, like domestic labor and what it means, and like gender and labor, because like we have like weird gender stuff, like I think all couples actually do, but like the public perception is different. So yeah, every night I take notes on what I make for dinner or dessert or snack or something. And then like when I have time, I have like just a list of dishes that I made. And I have been like taking out a lot of cookbooks from the library and just like writing about food. And it's really fun because I don't ever get tired of food. And it doesn't matter if this project takes shape, like I actually enjoy writing about this. So that has been good for me, because I was worried that I wouldn't have a thing that I had other stuff I was working on, but it wasn't fun. And now the book is like very imminently coming out and I'm actually having fun writing again. So that feels really good and promising as I like sometimes sink into the doom of like, my parents are going to read this memoir and like my life as I know it is over. Like, but I actually like writing again.
And with that,
That's great.
folks, if every panel was this good, we'd have a hell of a festival. But well, it might be. It might be. It's still early days. Today's Thursday. Tomorrow on Friday, we've got Seeing and Being Seen: Asian Americans in American Letters with Tracy O'Neill and Kevin Wen. After that, on Saturday, we've got, like 17 more events. Feel free to take a look at our schedule at 215festival.org/schedule. We do have a little bit more housekeeping. This panel, once again, is brought to you by the Creative Writing Program at Rutgers Camden, Lanternfish Press, and the whole show is being produced by The Stables, the creative marketing collective here in Philly. We'll give them some thanks. And once again, a huge thank you to Melissa, Christopher, and Krys for giving us a really wonderful evening of conversation about writing queer lives. Thank you all very much for being here.